Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and we will be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Chaf Amud Aleph. We have a bit of unfinished business here on Yud Tes Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn halachos Krias HaTorah, the halachos that govern and pertain to laning Krias HaTorah. We're here in Siman Lamed Zayin. We left off yesterday on the bottom line of Yud Tes Amud Beis, Siman Lamed Zayin, near the very end of Sif Gimel. So we're on the bottom line of Yud Tes Amud Beis, middle of the line by the words Parshas HaMoyadim. So let's put this in context. In Sif Gimel, the Mechaber was discussing what happens if the Baal Korei skips a pasuk. Do you have to make up that skipped pasuk or not? And we went through these halachos. The cases were quite complex, but in a nutshell, what the Mechaber said was, it really depends. Did this happen on a Monday or Thursday or Shabbos afternoon mincha, Krias HaTorah, a Krias HaTorah when you have 3 aliyahs, or did this happen on Shabbos? Now, what's the key difference between Monday, Thursday, Shabbos mincha, and Shabbos day? Very, very great difference. The difference is in the geder of the kriya. Let's remember, why do we lane on Monday and Thursday and Shabbos afternoon? This is a takana from Moshe Rabbeinu, a takana that later was modified by Ezra, takana of Ezra HaSofer. But in that takana, the takana in essence was they didn't want Klal Yisrael to go 3 days without hearing the Torah HaKdosha laned from a Sefer Torah. So they were misakin that we have to have Krias HaTorah on Monday, we have to have Krias HaTorah on Thursday. Now, we're going to have Krias HaTorah Shabbos morning, but we also have to have Krias HaTorah Shabbos afternoon, Mishum Yoshvei Kronos, because people are being mevatel, they're not doing anything, so we have to have a Krias HaTorah on Shabbos afternoon as well. Now, for those Kriyas, exactly what you lane is not so critical. Yes, we now have the minig that what we lane is, we lane until Sheni of the next week's Parsha. That's what we do, but that's not really critical in the original Gzeira. The original Gzeira was just that we have to lane something. Moshe Rabbeinu's takana was very, very basic. We need to take out a Sefer Torah, we need to lane something. Ezra later on modified the takana of Moshe Rabbeinu, and he made it a little bit more intense. And he said that on Monday, Thursday, Shabbos afternoon, we have to have 3 aliyahs. We have to have a minimum total of 10 psukim. Each aliyah has to have at least 3 psukim. By Moshe Rabbeinu, it was very, very simple. Take out a Sefer Torah lane. What should you lane? Something. How much should you lane? Something. Now, because that's the geder of Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos afternoon, said the Mechaber, if you skipped a pasuk, it doesn't really matter, because what you lane is not critical. It doesn't really matter. When does skipping a pasuk become a problem? If you skipped a pasuk in the kriya, and now you have less than 10 psukim, now you have a problem, because part of Ezra's takana was we need a minimum of 10 psukim. Now you don't have 10 psukim. Now already you have a problem. So that's Monday, Thursday, Shabbos mincha. How about Shabbos by day? Shabbos by day, the geder of the takana of Krias HaTorah is a different geder. Shabbos by day, we need to lane the parsha. We need to lane the parsha, and we need to hear every pasuk of the parsha. So now, if you skipped a pasuk on Shabbos morning, now you have a problem. Now you have to go back and you have to make up for that lost pasuk. Exactly how you do it, that was the topic of yesterday's shir. Very complicated. It depends exactly which aliyah it was skipped in, where in the parsha, when did you find out about it? So exactly how you go back, sometimes you're going to have to make a special aliyah, sometimes you're not going to have to make a special aliyah, but you definitely have to go back and make up for the lost pasuk. Not only do you have to go back and make up for the lost pasuk, and this is going to come out in today's share, the pasuk has to be covered by the brachas of an aliyah. So it's not just enough to go back into Sefer Torah and lane the pasuk that you missed. It's not even enough to go open up the Sefer Torah and lane the pasuk that you missed together with another 2 psukim, so that you should have 3 psukim. It has to be covered by the brachas of an aliyah. So Shabbos, it's critical that we hear every pasuk, and that every pasuk that we hear as part of the Krias HaTorah is covered by the brachas of an aliyah. So on Shabbos, it becomes a much bigger problem if you skip. Now we're here on the bottom line of Yotes Amud Beis, where the Mechaber is going to discuss how about Yom Tov. So the Mechaber says like this. The Mechaber says, Parshas Hamayadim, the Kriya that you lane on Yom Tov, which are the Parshios of the Torah that discuss the Yomim Tovim, Parshas Hamayadim, Dinam K'may Mincha B'Shabbos V'Sheni V'Chamishi. Those are similar in their geder to the Kriya of Monday and Thursday and Shabbos afternoon. Meaning that each individual pasuk of the Kriya that we laid on Yom Tov is not really part of the Chayvas Hayom. In other words, let me give you an example. Let's take a look at the Krias HaTorah of the second day of Pesach. Okay, second day of Pesach. What do we lane? Second day of Pesach, right? Pesach? Yeah, Pesach. Second day of Pesach. Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemar. Shor oy chesev oy eiz ki yivoled. If you have an ox or a sheep or a goat that was born, v'haya shivas yamim tachas imay. For 7 days it has to remain with its mother. Umeyayim hashmini v'hala. And from its 8th day and onward, yerotze lekarban ishal Hashem. It is now roid to be brought for a carbon. Okay, does this have anything to do with Pesach? There's absolutely nothing to do with Pesach. And the parsha goes on, and we're talking here about oisoi ve'espinoi, that an ox or a sheep, a cow or a sheep, if you shecht it and you shecht its offspring, you can't shecht them both on the same day. We go on over here. Finally, we reach Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemar Daber Bnei Yisrael V'amarta Alehem Moyadei Hashem Asher Tikro Yisam Yikroi Kodesh Elohei Moyadoi. Finally, we start talking about Yom Tovim. Oh, then we speak about Shabbos, until we finally get about Pesach. And then we have a few psukim here about Pesach. And then we start talking about Shavuos, and we talk about Sukkot, and we talk about, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. So how much of the Kriya is about Pesach? Not much of the Kriya is about Pesach. So this Kriya is not really a Kriya of Chayvas Hayom. Why do we lane all of these psukim? Because Chazal were Masakin, and it goes back to Ezra. That's what we had over here. Let's see, we had over here again in the Hakdama to our Siman. Not the Hakdama to our Siman, I'm sorry. To the Hakdama of Siman Kuf Lamed Hey, we said, Uba Yerushalmi Issa, the Yerushalmi in Masechtas Megillah says, Moshe Tike Lehem Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu was Mesakin. Shiu Kairin B'Torah B'Shabbosos V'Yom Tov U'B'Rosh Chodesh U'B'Chol Shamayid. This goes back again. This is a takon of Moshe Rabbeinu that we should lane on Yom Tov. And the Gemara in Megillah tells us that on Yom Tov we have 5 aliyahs. Why do we have 5 aliyahs on Yom Tov? Because the Gemara in Megillah tells us that the days that you have laning, depending on how much Kedusha those days have, depending on whether they have an Issa Malacha or they don't have an Issa Malacha, depending on the level of Kedusha, you have more and more aliyahs. So Shabbos has 7 aliyahs, Yom Kippur has 6 aliyahs, Yom Tov has 5 aliyahs, Chalamayid has 4 aliyahs, Rosh Chodesh has 4 aliyahs. A regular Monday, Thursday, Shabbos afternoon only has 3 aliyahs. So we have to have a Kriya, and we have to have 5 aliyahs. What exactly should we lane? So on Yom Tov, we lane about the Yom Tovim, and we make sure that we cover psukim that have to do with that particular Yom Tov. But it's a collection of psukim, and it's not every one of those psukim are Chayvas Hayom that we must hear that pasuk. So really, when you boil it down to its most important components, on Yom Tov, we need to have a Krias HaTorah. We need to have 5 aliyahs. Each one of the aliyahs have to have a minimum of 3 psukim, so we need 15 psukim. In the Bir Halacha, we're going to see that we also have to have something about that Yom Tov. So on Pesach, you have to learn some psukim that have to do with Pesach. On Sukkot, you have to learn some psukim that have to do with Sukkot. But it's not like a Shabbos. This week is Shabbos Parshas Nosai. It's a Chayvas HaYom. We have to hear every single pasuk of Parshas Nosai. On Sukkot, we don't have a Chiyuv Chayvas HaYom that we have to hear every single pasuk of the Sukkot Krias HaTorah. No, we need 5 aliyahs, we need a minimum of 15 psukim, and we need to learn something about Sukkot. Then we'll see we also need the Maftir. The Maftir, we have to learn the karbonos of that day. Interestingly enough, that does not come from Shas. That's a takanas ha'ga'onim. That Taisus tells us in Megillah, Lamed Amud Beis. Taisus tells us that comes from Rav Amram Goyin. So that's a takanas ha'ga'onim, that we have to have the Maftir. We have to learn the karbonos hayom. That's a chayvas hayom. We have to learn the karbonos of the day. So now that against this backdrop, what's the Mechaber telling me over here? From the bottom of Yud Tes Amud Beis to the end of Siv Gimel, he's telling me what's the status of the Yom Tov laning if you skip a pasuk. Says the Mechaber, it's similar to Monday and Thursday at Shabbos afternoon. If you skip a pasuk, it's non-critical. Why? Because we don't have a chiyuv to hear every pasuk of the Yom Tov laning. So of course, jumps in the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Yud Aleph, the bottom line of Yud Tes Amud Beis, Umayri shall kol panim karu lechamisha gavri shloisha psukim lechalechad kadin. Of course, when the Mechaber says that each and every individual pasuk of the Yom Tov laning is not critical, that's only if you called up 5 aliyahs and each oila had 3 psukim. So you had a minimum total of 15 psukim, and it was divided up 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, so that each oila had at least 3 psukim. If you didn't do that, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you didn't do that, if you only called up 4 aliyahs, or you called up 5 aliyahs, but one of the aliyahs only had 2 psukim, then you're going to have to go back and fix that mistake, which is largely going to be the topic of the rest of today's shir, how exactly you fix that mistake. Okay, so very complicated, but in a nutshell, the first halacha that we have in today's shir, in the end of Sif Gimel, is we have been discussing the question of what happens if the Baal Korei skips a pasuk. In a nutshell, what we said is a skipped pasuk at Shabbos is a problem. Because on Shabbos, we have a chayvas hayom to hear every single pasuk of the kriya, of that week's parsha. And they have to be covered by the brachas of an aliyah. So right away, if a pasuk was skipped, it's an issue, and we have to fix that mistake. Monday, Thursday, Shabbos afternoon, a skipped pasuk is not critical. Why? Because me'ikar adin, Monday, Thursday, Shabbos afternoon, you can learn whatever you want. During the week of Parshas Nasa, you want to learn Parshas Noach on Monday and Thursday, Yaitza. That's not the minig, it's not what we do, it's not l'chatchila. But if the Baal Korei would get up and say, hey, I prepared Parshas Noach, I didn't prepare Parshas Nasai, and he'll learn Parshas Noach, and they'll call up 3 aliyahs, and they'll do 10 psukim in Parshas Noach, and then somebody will say, and that's funny, I didn't think this week was Noach. Guess what? You were Yaitza, because you made sure that Klal Yisrael didn't go 3 days without hearing Krias HaTorah from a Sefer Torah. You called up 3 aliyahs. Each one had a minimum of 3 psukim. You laned a total of 10 psukim. What you laned is not critical. When does a skipped pasuk become a problem? On Monday, Thursday, or Shabbos afternoon? Only if because of the skipped pasuk, you didn't hit the minimum of 10 psukim. Or one of the aliyahs didn't hit the minimum of 3 psukim. Then you have a problem. Says the Mechaber, Yom Tov is not like Shabbos. Yom Tov is like Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos afternoon. The individual psukim are not critical, because really, apparently, you can learn anything. We're going to see in the Bir Halacha, you have to have some mention of that particular Yom Tov. But as far as the 5 aliyahs of a Yom Tov, what you learn, not critical. So you skip the pasuk, not critical. When does a skipped pasuk become a problem? If you didn't have 5 aliyahs. Or if one of the 5 aliyahs didn't have the minimum of 3 psukim. Then is when a skipped pasuk is going to become a problem on Yom Tov. Now, let's take a look here. Now, in the rest of this Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Yod Aleph, we're on the top line of the Mishnah Berurah on Chaf Amid Aleph, Va'ayin b'Magen Avram. And here's where things get a little bit more complex. Says the Mishnah Berurah as follows. Va'ayin b'Magen Avram. He says, take a look at the Magen Avram. Shekosaf, who writes, Dehu adin im dileg eze psukim mea psukim shekairin b'sefer Torah shniya lemaftir avor chayvas hayoim. Let's remember that on Yom Tov we take out 2 Sifrei Torah. The first Sefer Torah we lay 5 aliyahs. That's the Kriya that we've been speaking about on Yom Tov until now. That's what the Mechaber means when he refers to Parshas Hamayadim. Those 5 aliyahs, skipped pasuk, not so critical, because the individual psukim are not critical. But, says the Magen Avram, he says, if you skip some of the psukim, let's read it again. Magen Avram Chekasev. Dehu adin, the same halacha would apply. Which halacha? We'll see in a minute. Im dileg eze pasuk me'apsukim, if you skip one of the psukim from the psukim shekairin b'sefer Torah shniya, that you lane out of the second Sefer Torah on Yom Tov limaftir, which is the maftir, avor chayvas hayoim, that laning is chayvas hayoim. That laning is the laning that details the karbonos that we bring for the carbon musaf on Yom Tov. Dahainu psuke carbon musaf. These are the psukim that detail the carbon musaf. She'enoi chayzer. You don't have to go back. Imloi, unless shechiser ikron shel psukim legamri. Unless you skip the ikr psukim. The psukim that really delineate that day's carbon. Dahainu, for example, and I have a Maftir here handy. Dahainu, b'Shabbos she'ira b'yom rishon de chalamoyed sukkos. Let's say the first day of chalamoyed sukkos falls out on Shabbos. She'kairin lemaftir, where you're going to lane for the maftir, you're going to lane the carbon musaf of 2 days of sukkos. Let's remember, Sukkot, the carbon musaf for every single day of Sukkot is a different carbon. Every day of Sukkot, Yom Tov, Chalamayid, every day of Sukkot had a carbon musaf. And no 2 days had the same carbon musaf. That's what we call the Parei Achog, the cows that were brought, the bull offerings that were brought on the Mizbeach for the carbon musaf on Yom Tov. Every day was different, okay? So now, when the first day of Chalamayid, we're talking Chutz La'aretz, when the first day of Chalamayid falls out on Shabbos, what do we lane? We lane the carbon musaf of 2 days. We lane Bayom HaSheni, U Bayom HaShlishi. Now, let me take out a Maftir here so that you can understand what it is that we're talking about. So I open up my Maftir and I go to Shabbos Chalamayid. Shabbos Chalamayid. Right? I have my beautiful art scroll Maftir here. Shabbos Chalamayid. First day of Chalamayid. What do you lane for the Maftir if Shabbos falls out on the first day of Chalamayid? Why are we discussing Shabbos? I'll tell you that in a minute. But right now we're discussing Shabbos B'dafka. The first day of Chalamayid, Sukkot, fell out on Shabbos. What do we lane? So it's 1 aliyah. The Maftir is only 1 aliyah. What do we lane? Uvayom HaSheni, on the second day of Sukkot. What are the karbonos? Parim b'nei bakar shneim asar. We bring 12 bulls. Elim shnoyim, 14 lambs. Kvasim b'nei shana, 1 year old. I'm sorry. B'yom HaSheni, parim b'nei bakar shneim asar. We have 12 bulls. Elim shnoyim, 2 rams. Kvasim b'nei shana, 1 year old sheep. Arba asar, 14. That's the first Timimim. They can't have any mum. They can't have a blemish. That's pasuk number 1. Then the next pasuk describes the menachos, the flour offerings that came together with these animals, v'niskehem, and the wine libations, the nesachim, that came together with these karbanos. U'minchasav v'niskehem la'parim la'elim v'la'kfasim b'misparim kamishpat. Usir izim echad chatos, you bring 1 goat for a carbon chatos. Milavad oilas hatamid, this is all besides the carbon tamid that you bring every day. U'minchasav v'niskehem. Then the Maftir goes on, ubayom hashlishi. And on the 3rd day of Sukkot, parim ashtei asar. you bring 11 bulls. So how many bulls did you bring on the second day? On the second day, you brought 12 bulls. On the third day, you brought 11 bulls. So again, if the Maftir, if the first day of Chol Hamoed Sukkos falls out on Shabbos, you're going to take out 2 Sifrei Torah. From the first Sefer Torah, you have a whole Kriya over here from Shmois Lamed Gimel. You have a whole parsha. This is from Kisisa. You have a whole laning over here from Parshas Kisisa. Part of it is the laning that we lay on the Titus Tzibur, Psal and Vayechal. That's the Iker Kriya. That's the 5. It's Shabbos, so it's going to be 7 aliyahs. Then the second Sefer Torah, you have Maftir. What does the Maftir describe? It describes the Karbanos for the second day of Yom Tov and for the third day of Yom Tov. Now, why does the Maftir of the first day of Chol Hamoed describe the carbon musaf of the second day of Yom Tov and the third day of Yom Tov? Because in Chutz La'aretz, we're worried about Tzveika D'Yoma. In Chutz La'aretz, we originally they had a suffix. Which day is it really? The first day Chol Hamoed in Chutz La'aretz could theoretically either be the second day of Yom Tov, or it could be the third day of Yom Tov. So since we have officially this Tzveika D'Yoma, although we don't really have a Tzveika D'Yoma, Anon B'Kviya D'Yarcha, we know that really it's the second day of Yom Tov, not really the third day of Yom Tov. We know that. But Minig Aviseinu B'Yodenu, so we deal with Tzveika D'Yoma in an official capacity. So we're going to lane on the first day of Chol Hamoed, we're going to describe the Karban Musaf for the second day of Yom Tov and the Karban Musaf of the third day of Yom Tov. What are we getting at over here? So again, the Mishnah Berurah is bringing down the Magen Avram that discusses how about if you skip a pasuk from the Maftir. We discussed what happens if you skip a pasuk from the main laning of Yom Tov, from the 5 aliyahs of Yom Tov, or from the 7 aliyahs on Shabbos that falls out on Yom Tov. And we said that those psukim are not really critical. We just have to make sure that you have the right amount of aliyahs, and each aliyah has the minimum 3 psukim. But how about the Maftir? Is the Maftir critical? Says the Magen Avram, it depends which psukim of the Maftir. So let's look at it inside. Says the Magen Avram like this. The same formula will apply if you skip psukim from the Maftir that you lane out of the second Sefer Torah. Dahainu psuke Karban Musaf. These are the psukim that describe the Karban Musaf. She'enoi chayzer. The same way you don't have to go back if you skipped psukim during the regular laning of Yom Tov, because each individual pasuk is not critical, so too, psukim from the Maftir are also not critical. But wait a minute, that's not true of all of the psukim. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, unless you missed some of the ikar psukim, some of the main psukim of the Maftir. What does that mean? Dahainu. For example, says the Magen Avram, B'Shabbos she'ira ba yom rishon de Chol Hamoed Sukkos. If the first day of Chol Hamoed Sukkos falls out on Shabbos, she'kayrin leMaftir, where you're going to lane out of the Maftir Sefer, you're going to lane the Karbanos of 2 days. B'yom hasheni u b'yom hashlishi. You're going to lane the psukim that describe the Karbanos of the second day of Yom Tov and the psukim that describe the Karbanos of the third day of Yom Tov. V'hu dileg u b'yom hashlishi. The Baal Korei got up and he goofed. He only laned ubayom hasheni. For the Maftir, on the first day Chol Hamoed that fell out on Shabbos, he didn't lane the psukim that describe the Karbanos of day 3. He only laned the psukim that describe the Karbanos of day 2. Af al pi shekara bayom hasheni, even though he laned the psukim that describe the Karbanos of the second day, or bayom hasheni, heavy ki'ilu loy kara klal meichayvas hayom. We have a problem now. It's as if he didn't lay Maftir at all. Why? L'didon de bekian bekfiyat de yache. Because I misspoke before, by the way. I just realized now. We know the true calendar. And we know that the first day of Chol Hamoed is really the third day of Yom Tov. We know that the day that we keep as the first day of Yom Tov is really the first day of Yom Tov. The day that we keep as the second day of Yom Tov is really the first day of Chol Hamoed. But we keep it Kodesh anyway because of Minig Aviseinu B'Yadeinu. And what we call the first day of Chol Hamoed is really the third day of Yom Tov. So if the Baal Korei on the first day of Chol Hamoed that fell out on Shabbos, if he only laned half the Maftir, if he laned the Karbanos of the second day of Yom Tov, but he left out the Karbanos of the third day of Yom Tov, then guess what? He skipped the main psukim of Krias HaTorah. He skipped the main psukim that are chiv to hear today. Because we know that today is the third day of Yom Tov, and you didn't lane the Karbanos of the third day of Yom Tov. And therefore, we would have a problem. We would have to go back. Because the psukim that was skipped are critical. You want to skip, you want to do it the other way. Now let's continue to Mishnah Berurah in the brackets. Miu im karu bayom hashlishi. If he laned the karbanos of the third day, if he laned the bayom hashlishi, v'dileg v'loy karu bayom hasheni, and he skipped the beginning of the Maftir, he skipped the bayom hasheni, the psukim that describe the karbanos of the second day of Yom Tov, einay chayzer likreis bevracha, then we don't have to go back and relane the bayom hasheni with an oila, with brachas and everything else. No, we don't have to. Because you didn't miss anything critical. We don't need that. That's not really Krias HaTorah. Ella Pesach HaSefer Torah. You should open a Sefer Torah v'karu elu apsukim lifnei atzibur b'loi bracha, and lane it, just to cover the minig without a bracha. But they're not critical. They're not critical. Vayin be'el Yerabah, and take a look at the El Yerabah, says the Mishnah Berurah, that continues along the same theme. Shahoy he also says, sometimes, even if you skip only one pasuk from the Maftir, you're going to have to go back and lane that over again with a bracha. For example, if that pasuk was a critical pasuk for Krias HaTorah, for example, says the Mishnah Berurah in the brackets, Shedileg b'mashekoyin lemaftir b'yom rishon shel Pesach. What's the Maftir of the first day of Pesach? So the Maftir of the first day of Pesach, u'b'chodesh harishon, in the first month, Nisan, b'arba asar yom l'chodesh, on the 14th day of the month, Pesach l'Hashem. That's Pesach. Is that a critical pasuk? No. It mentions Pesach, but it doesn't describe any karbanos. That's not a critical pasuk for Krias HaTorah. Ubechamisha asar yom l'chodesh hazeh, on the 15th day of this month of Nisan, Chag, it's a Yom Tov. Shivas yamim matzah yachil. For 7 days you have to eat matzah. Is that a critical pasuk for Krias HaTorah? No. It talks about the Yom Tov of Pesach. It talks about eating matzah, but that's not critical for Krias HaTorah. It doesn't discuss the karbanos. By Yom HaRishon, on the first day, Mikra Kodesh is a Yom Tov. Kamalechas avoda lo yisasu. Again, not a critical pasuk. Now we're going to come to critical psukim. V'hikraftem isha oila l'Hashem. You should be makriv a carbon, a fire offering, a carbon oila t'Hashem. Parim b'nei bakar shnayim. 2 bulls, v'ayal echad, 1 ram, v'shiva kvasim, 7 sheep b'nei shana, 7 1-year-old sheep. Tibimim yulachem, they have to be tibimim, they can't be balimum. Umin chasam, and what's the carbon mincha? Silas b'lula b'shaman, shloisha esradim al parshne esradim loyal tasu. Isarain, we keep on describing the nesachim. Isarain, the mincha. Isarain tasel lekevas echad l'shivas akvasim. Then the next pasuk is the carbon chatos. Usi er chatos echad lechaper aleichem. Okay, those were the critical psukim. From v'hikraftem until lechaper aleichem. How many psukim is that? That's v'hikraftem is 1 pasuk. Ubin chasam, 2 psukim. Isarin, 3 psukim. Usi'ir chatas echad, 4 psukim. Then it goes to l'milovad oilas haboiker. This is beside the carbon oila. We don't need this. This is already not critical. So says the El Yarabba, he says, Kigoyin, Shadileg b'mashekarin lamaftir b'yamrijit shel Pesach. If you skipped from the Maftir of the first day of Pesach, mi pasuk v'hikraftem, from the pasuk that begins v'hikraftem, ulahola and on, ad lechaper aleichem, if you skipped one pasuk from those 4 psukim, demisham v'hala ein shayach kol kach l'chovos hayom, because after that is not critical for chovos hayom, and before that was also not critical. U'b'yom rishon shel Sukkos, or on the first day of Sukkos. Okay. Im dileg eze psukim min v'hikraftem ad soif haparsha. If you skipped from the carbon musaf, from the Maftir, on the first day of Sukkos, if you skipped from v'hikraftem, okay, let's see, that is the second pasuk of the Maftir, that begins v'hikraftem oile ishe reich nichayak l'Hashem parim b'nei bakar shloisha aser elim shnaim kvasim b'nei shana arba aser timimim yiyu. If you skipped from there until the end of the Musaf, oy shechiser b'yom rishon shechal hamayit k'shechal b'Shabbos eze pasuk shu b'parshas b'yom hashlishi. Again, these are critical psukim. Then you would have to go back and you would have to repeat. Let's just finish off the Mishnah Berurah over here. So what's the takeaway? I know that this all sounds very, very complex, but the takeaway so far is very, 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 very simple. We had a mechaber in Sif Gimel that told me if you missed a pasuk on Shabbos, you got a problem. Because every single pasuk from the parsha on Shabbos is critical for Chayvas Hayom. So if the Baal Korei skipped a pasuk, you got to go back, you got to make it up, and it's got to be covered by the brachas of an aliyah. If you missed a pasuk on Monday, Thursday, or Shabbos Mincha, the individual pasukim are not critical. So it's only a problem if you didn't get the minimum number of pasukim either in the total of the laning or for an individual aliyah. You didn't have 3 pasukim, you only had 2 pasukim. Yom Tov, the 5 aliyahs, the 5 primary aliyahs of the laning on Yom Tov, each pasuk is not critical. What's critical? You have to have 5 aliyahs, 3 each. So you have to have a total of 15, and each aliyah has to have 5. Other than that, not critical. We're going to see an exception in the Bir Halacha. But now the Mishnah Berurah brought down the Magen Avram that discusses the Maftir. Maftir is Takanas HaGa'onim, that we have to lane the Karbanas Hayom. Says the Mishnah Berurah in the name of the Magen Avram, not every pasuk of the Maftir is critical, but the psukim that describe the actual Karbanas, and the menachos of the Karbanas, and the nesakim of the Karbanas, and the Karban Chatas, those psukim are critical. So if you miss one of those psukim, you got to go back. If you miss one of the ancillary psukim that are just tacked on to the Maftir, that discuss the Yom Tov, on the 15th day of the month we have a Yom Tov, doesn't discuss the Karbanas, those psukim are not critical. Now let's take a look at a Bir Halacha. By me, the Bir Halacha starts on Yutes Amid Beis. It's Bir Halacha Dibra Maschil Parshiyos HaMoyadim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ayin b'Mishnah Berurah, take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Ma shehechlatnu b'shem El Yarabba le'inyan karbanos humusafim. This that I said in the name of the El Yarabba in regards to the laning, to the Maftir, that describes the Karban Musaf of Yom Tov. The imdileg me ikar chayvas hayom, that if you skip one of the psukim that are the ikar chayvas hayom, one of the psukim that actually describe the Karban Musaf, the chayzer, that for that you have to go back. Now, the Chavetz Chaim is going to extend that concept to the main 5 aliyahs of Yom Tov as well. And he says like this, Ulufize, according to this, nire, it seems, l'chayra, tohu adin b'parshiyas hamoyadim, that the same halacha applies to the actual laning of Yom Tov, not the Maftir, the main 5 aliyahs. Even though the Mechaber said the main 5 aliyahs of Yom Tov, the Parshas HaMayadim, they're not critical. Says the Chavetz Chaim in the Biur Halacha, not so fast. Im dileg me'ikr mashe shaykh liyom tov zeh, if you skip the psukim of the main laning that describe the Yom Tov that you're on, kegoin b'chag HaSukkos, for example, if on Sukkos, shaloi kara parshas chag HaSukkos klal, where you don't lane about the Yom Tov of Sukkos in the primary kriya at all, rak kara chamisha kruim ad tishpesu shabbatchem, and instead what you do is you make 5 aliyahs. You see the laning on Sukkos, the primary laning, it starts Sharoi Chesed Vayez. That's the Kohen. The Levi starts Eila Mayadeh Hashem Ikroi Kodesh Asher Tikroi Saba Mayadam. But the Levi does not lane about Sukkos at all. The Levi lanes about Pesach. He lanes about Pesach. And then he lanes about the Carbon Oimer. Then the Shlishi lanes about Shavuos. The Revi lanes about Rosh Hashanah. And then he lanes about Yom Kippur. And it's not until the Chamishi, now the Revi, the 4th aliyah ends, May Erev ad Erev Tishpesu Shabbatchem. Now you finally up to Chamishi. Chamishi lanes about Sukkos. Vayedaber Hashem HaMoshe Lemar Dabra B'nai Yisrael Lemar B'chamish Asa Yom L'Chodesh Hashvi Yazeh, the 15th day of Tishrei, Chag HaSukkah Yishivas Kabim L'Hashem. So it's not until Chamishi, it's not until the last of the 5 aliyahs that you start laning about Sukkos. So says the Biur Halacha, let's say on Sukkos they goof, and they make 5 aliyahs out of the original 4. They make 5 aliyahs, and the 5th aliyah ends Tishpesu Shabbatchem. So they didn't lay a word about Sukkos. Says the Biur Halacha, that's the same halacha that we just learned about Maftir. In the 5 primary aliyahs of Yom Tov, there are also psukim that are critical. Which psukim? The psukim that describe the Yom Tov that you're on. So again, in the Biur Halacha, he says, Kigoin, b'chag HaSukkos, if on Sukkos, shaloi kara parshas chag HaSukkos klal, if you don't lane about Sukkos at all, rak kara chamisha kruim, and what you do is you make 5 aliyahs ad tishpesu shabbatchem, until Chamishi, not including Chamishi. From Kayin, Levi, Shlishi, and Revi, you made 5 aliyahs. And you ended off the 5th aliyah, Tishpesu Shabbatchem, which was talking about Yom Kippur. So you never got to Sukkos. You never laned about Sukkos. V'niska zeh lacha shekara ha-maftir, and you don't realize the mistake until after Maftir. T'tzarech lachzor v'liftayach ha-sefer, you're going to have to open up the Sefer Torah again. V'likroi zua parsha, and you're going to have to lane the parsha, you're going to have to lane the Chamishi, which is about Sukkos, bibracha lefaneo lachreh, with a special aliyah. Because you didn't cover the Ikar Chayvas Hayom. The Ikar Chayvas Hayom is to lane about Sukkos. Okay, wow. So we're 39 minutes into the shir, and we just finished Sif Gimel. All right, as much as I hate to do this, I'm going to have to stop now. Because Sif Dalid, if you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, you'll see that there's a very lengthy Mishnah Berurah Ois Cut and Yud Gimel. I can't start Mishnah Berurah Ois Cut and Yud Gimel and not finish it. So as much as I hate to do it, I'm going to have to stop over here. I will try to work hard that we shouldn't fall behind, but I'm not going to sacrifice the clarity of the shir. I hope that this very complicated subject of today, I hope I delivered it well. I hope it was clear. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch should send Yeshua Serfuas Panasat Shedruchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek. B'mhera of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.